Outlaw's widow hid in the desert. Until a sheriff offered to marry her, she buried her outlaw husband with blood still fresh under her fingernails. And now the law was coming for her. The cave smelled of death and her own fear. Sarah McKinnon pressed her back against the rough stone wall, listening to the desert silence that stretched between her heartbeats. 3 days had passed since she'd clawed Jack's grave from the hardpan earth with nothing but a rusted spoon and her bare hands. 3 days since she'd watched the notorious Jack McKinnon, the man whose name made sheriffs reach for their guns and mothers pull their children closer, die not in a blaze of gunfire, but choking on blood from lungs that had finally surrendered to 20 years of dust and violence. The irony tasted bitter as the alkali water she'd been rationing. Her fingers trembled as she counted the hardtack again. For pieces left, each no bigger than a silver dollar. The jerky had run out yesterday, and the last drops of water in her canteen caught the afternoon light like liquid amber, precious and nearly gone. Above her hiding place, buzzards rode the thermals in lazy circles, patient as undertakers. Jack used a joke that buzzards could smell a man's death 3 days before it happened. Sarah pulled her knees tighter to her chest and wondered if they could smell hers too. The wedding ring felt strange on her finger, unfamiliar weight after 3 days of clawing earth and stone. She'd buried it with Jack, along with the small leather Bible her mother had pressed into her hands the day she'd run away to marry him. Some things shouldn't follow you into the ground, she'd whispered to his still face, but sitting here now, with hunger gnawing at her stomach like a living thing, she wondered if she should have kept the ring to trade for food. If she lived long enough to trade anything ever again. The federal marshals would come first, she knew. They'd been tracking Jack's gang across 3 territories, and everyone knew Mrs. Jack McKinnon rode with her husband. Never mind that she'd spent 5 years begging him to stop, tending his wounds, and praying rosaries over his fevered sleep. Never mind that the only crimes she'd committed were loving a dangerous man and staying loyal when wisdom screamed at her to run. In the eyes of the law, love made you guilty. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to be Sarah Collins, the baker's daughter from Tucson who dreamed of white picket fences and babies with soft hair. That girl had died the night Jack McKinnon rode into town with silver spurs and promises that tasted like whiskey and wild honey. What remained was this hollow-eyed woman who knew how to clean bullet wounds and sleep light enough to wake at the sound of approaching horses. A sound made her freeze. Hoofbeats. Single horse, moving slow and deliberate across the rocky ground. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she pressed deeper into the shadow of her cave. The rider stopped maybe 30 yards away, and she could hear leather creaking as he dismounted. Mrs. McKinnon. The voice carried across the distance like smoke, weathered but not unkind. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew that voice. Every outlaw west of the Pecos knew that voice. Sheriff Thomas Brennan. I know you're here, Sarah. He spoke her Christian name like he knew her, like they'd shared Sunday dinners instead of existing on opposite sides of a war that had claimed her husband and would likely claim her too. I can see where you buried him. Did proper, too. Most folks wouldn't have bothered. Sarah bit her lip hard enough to taste blood. Through the narrow opening of her cave, she could see his silhouette against the red horizon, tall and lean, hat tilted against the sun. He made no move toward her hiding place, just stood there beside his horse like he had all the time in the world. You must be hungry, he said. Thirsty, too. Been 3 days since anyone's seen smoke from a cooking fire in these hills. The kindness in his voice almost broke her. When was the last time someone had spoken to her with simple human concern? Not since before Jack got sick, maybe longer. The outlaw life didn't leave room for gentle words. I'm not here to hurt you, Sheriff Brennan continued. His voice carried the weight of a man who'd seen too much death and had grown tired of adding to it. But you can't stay out here much longer. This desert doesn't forgive, and there are folks coming who won't be as understanding as me. Sarah closed her eyes and felt tears she couldn't afford to lose track hot trails down her dusty cheeks. She thought of Jack's last words, whispered through bloody lips. Don't let them make you pay for my sins, Sarah. You find a way to live. Maybe this was how you learned to live again. Maybe redemption started with stepping out of the shadows and trusting that not every man with a badge had murder in his heart. The desert wind picked up, stirring the dust around her feet like the ghosts of all her choices. Somewhere overhead, a buzzard cried once, sharp and lonely in the vast silence. Sarah McKinnon took a deep breath, tasted sand and sorrow and something that might have been hope, and prepared to face whatever mercy or judgment waited in the dying light. The sheriff didn't draw his gun. He offered her his water canteen and a proposal that would either save her life or damn her soul. Sheriff Thomas Brennan didn't reach for his Colt. Instead, he walked 20 paces from her cave and settled himself on a flat boulder like a man preparing for a long conversation. The leather of his holster remained unsnapped, his hands resting easy on his knees. Sarah watched from the shadows as he removed his hat, revealing hair the color of winter wheat touched with silver at the temples. "You can come out when you're ready," he said, his voice carrying no more threat than a neighbor calling across a fence. "Or I can talk to these rocks. Either way suits me fine." Sarah's throat felt like sand, but she stayed hidden. Brennan reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a canteen. The sound of water sloshing inside made Sarah's tongue stick to the roof of her mouth. He unscrewed the cap and took a long drink, then held it out toward her cave. "Water's clean," he said. "Spring-fed from up near Prescott. Cold, too." The offer hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant campfire. Sarah pressed her palm against the stone wall, feeling the heat the rock had absorbed from the day's sun. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, but her body betrayed her with its needs. 3 days of rationed sips had left her dizzy, her lips cracked like old leather. "I know what you're thinking," Brennan continued, settling back against the boulder. "Every lawman you've ever met has been hunting you. Why should I be different?" He was right. Sheriff's badges meant bounty money and federal rewards. They meant rope and scaffold and unmarked graves for outlaw wives who'd run out of places to hide. "Truth is, I've been wearing this star for 16 years, Brennan said, studying the badge pin to his vest. 16 years of chasing men who'd rather die than surrender, burying boys too young to shave, writing letters to mothers who'll never see their sons again. Gets heavy after a while, all that dying." Sarah found herself leaning forward, drawn by something in his voice, a weariness she recognized in her own bones. "I knew your husband," Brennan continued. "Not personal-like, but I knew his reputation. Fast gun, quick temper, loyal to his men. The kind of outlaw who'd rather face 10-to-1 odds than surrender." He paused, rolling a pebble under his boot. "But I also heard tell he married a baker's daughter from Tucson. Girl who tried to talk him out of the life every chance she got." Heat flooded Sarah's cheeks. How did he know that? How did anyone know about the fights, the tears, the nights she'd begged Jack to walk away from the gang? Federal marshals don't much care about the difference between riding with outlaws and being married to one, Brennan said. "They're coming through Copper Falls tomorrow, asking questions. Got a warrant with your name on it." Fear crawled up Sarah's spine like ice water. She'd known this moment would come, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real as the stone beneath her feet. "They'll hang you," Brennan said simply. "Not because you robbed banks or shot anyone, but because they need someone to pay for Jack McKinnon's sins, and you're what's left." Sarah closed her eyes and saw the scaffold, felt the rough hemp against her throat. Was this how it ended? Dying for crimes she'd never committed, paying for love that had already cost her everything? "Unless," Brennan said. The word hit her like a physical blow. Unless. Such a small word to carry so much weight. "Unless what?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the desert stillness. Brennan turned toward her cave, though she knew he couldn't see her in the shadows. "Unless you're married to a man the law respects. A sheriff, say. Someone whose word carries weight with federal marshals." Sarah's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I could use a wife," Brennan replied, his voice steady as bedrock. "Not for love, wouldn't insult either of us by pretending that. But for companionship, someone to share the coffee and the silence, someone to tend the house while I'm chasing ghosts across the territory." The proposal struck her speechless. Marriage, to a stranger. to a lawman who'd spent years hunting men like her husband. "You're crazy," she breathed. "Maybe," Brennan agreed. "But I'm also tired. Tired of eating beans from a can and talking to my horse like he understands. Tired of coming home to an empty house that echoes with nothing but my own footsteps." He stood and walked closer to her hiding place, stopping just outside pistol range, close enough to talk, far enough to respect her fear. "I'm 43 years old, Sarah McKinnon. Never married. Never found a woman willing to share a life with danger and loneliness. But you already know what it costs to love a man who lives by the gun. You know how to tend wounds and sleep light and keep your own counsel." Sarah's mind reeled. Marriage to this stranger would mean safety from federal nooses, but what kind of life would it be? What kind of woman traded one form of imprisonment for another? "Why?" she asked. "Why would you risk your reputation for someone like me?" Brennan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute truth. "Because 16 years of hunting outlaws has taught me something about justice. Real justice isn't about revenge or making examples. It's about giving people a chance to be better than their worst choices." He held up the canteen again. "Your husband's dead, Sarah. His debts died with him. What you do now, that's your choice to make." The water caught the last rays of sunlight, gleaming like liquid hope. Sarah thought of Jack's final words, his plea for her to find a way to live. Maybe this was it. Maybe redemption came not as forgiveness, but as an unexpected hand extended in the darkness. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "what kind of wife would I be to you?" "The honest kind," Brennan replied. "Nothing more, nothing less." Sarah Collins McKinnon closed her eyes and felt the weight of all her yesterdays pressing against the fragile possibility of tomorrow. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the desert answered with its ancient song of survival. She married the sheriff in a borrowed dress while the whole town whispered, "Outlaw's whore." But when their eyes met during the vows, something unexpected stirred in the silence. The blue dress hung loose on Sarah's frame, meant for a woman who'd never known hunger. She stood before the cracked mirror in Martha Henley's boarding house, adjusting the fabric that smelled of lavender soap and other women's dreams. 3 weeks had passed since she'd emerged from that cave with Sheriff Brennan's canteen pressed to her lips like salvation. 3 weeks of hiding in this small room while he made arrangements, filed papers, and convinced the territorial judge that Sarah Collins, not Sarah McKinnon, deserved a chance at redemption. "It belonged to my daughter," Martha said, smoothing the wrinkles from a skirt. She wore it to her own wedding before consumption took her. Said blue was the color of hope. Sarah's throat tightened. Hope felt dangerous, like a flame too close to dry timber. But as she looked at her reflection, clean hair braided with wildflowers, skin scrubbed free of desert dust, she almost recognized the girl she'd once been. Almost. The walk to the church felt like a funeral march. Copper Falls had turned out for the spectacle, faces pressed against windows and gathered in small clusters along the dusty main street. Sarah heard their whispers follow her like shadows. "Dead outlaw's whore." "Sheriff's lost his mind. Ought to string her up proper." Each word cut deeper than Apache arrows, but Thomas walked beside her with his shoulders square and his chin up, never flinching, never apologizing for his choice. His wedding clothes were simple, black coat brushed clean, white shirt pressed sharp as a blade, boots polished to mirror brightness. He looked like a man attending Sunday service, not a funeral. "Don't listen to them," he murmured as they reached the church steps. "They'll find something else to talk about come winter." But Sarah knew better. Some stains never wash clean. Inside the small wooden church, dust motes danced in colored light from stained glass windows that had traveled all the way from St. Louis. The pews held maybe 24 souls, mostly the curious and the cruel, drawn by the scandal of a lawman marrying an outlaw's widow. Sarah recognized none of them as friends. Preacher Morrison waited at the altar, his Bible worn smooth by decades of frontier weddings and funerals. He'd baptized babies and buried gunfighters, married ranchers' daughters, and blessed dying prospectors. But his eyes held questions when they settled on Sarah, as if he wondered whether God's grace extended to women who'd shared beds with killers. "We are gathered here," he began, his voice echoing in the near-empty church, "in the sight of God and these witnesses." The words washed over Sarah like water over stone. She found herself studying Thomas's profile instead, the weathered lines around his eyes, the careful way he held his hands, the small scar above his left temple that spoke of violence survived. This man was a stranger, yet in 20 minutes he would be her husband, her protection, her unexpected salvation. When Morrison asked if she took Thomas Brennan to be her lawful wedded husband, Sarah's voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "I do." Thomas's response followed hers like an echo, and then Morrison was pronouncing them husband and wife with the same solemnity he'd used to read last rites. But when Thomas turned to face her, Sarah saw something in his gray eyes that made her breath catch. Not love. Neither of them had promised that. But something quieter, more lasting. Recognition, maybe. The look of two broken souls acknowledging their shared hunger for peace. His kiss was gentle, brief as a whisper. It tasted of coffee and possibility. The congregation dispersed quickly after the ceremony, eager to spread gossip like wildfire across the territory. Sarah found herself standing alone with Thomas in the empty church, golden afternoon light slanting through the windows to paint everything the color of honey. "Well, Mrs. Brennan," Thomas said, and the name sounded strange on his tongue. "Shall we go home?" "Home?" Sarah turned the word over in her mind like a foreign coin. When had she last had a place that deserved that name? Jack's hideouts had been caves and lined shacks, temporary shelters between jobs. Before that, her father's bakery had felt more like a prison than a refuge. Thomas's house sat at the edge of town, a simple adobe structure with thick walls and a red tile roof. Inside, everything spoke of a man's solitary life. Furniture built for function rather than comfort, shelves lined with law books and territorial maps, a kitchen equipped for beans and coffee, but little else. "I cleared out the chest in the bedroom," Thomas said, suddenly awkward. "For your things. Though I suppose you don't have much." Sarah shook her head. Everything she owned fit in a small cloth bundle. A spare dress, her mother's rosary, and a daguerreotype of her parents taken before the consumption claimed them both. The accumulation of 31 years reduced to objects that could fit in a saddlebag. "I can sleep on the sofa," Thomas offered, reading her silence. Until we figure things out." Sarah studied the wide bed that dominated the small room. It looked large enough for two people to sleep without touching, like parallel graves. She thought of Jack, how he'd pulled her close in the darkness, his body radiating heat and desperation. This would be different. This would be survival disguised as marriage, companionship built on necessity rather than passion. "We'll manage," she said quietly. That first night, they lay on opposite sides of the bed like strangers sharing a stagecoach seat. Thomas's breathing was steady, controlled, the rhythm of a man who'd trained himself to sleep light in dangerous country. Sarah stared at the ceiling and listened to coyotes singing their ancient songs beyond the walls. The unfamiliar gold band caught moonlight from the window, a perfect circle that promised nothing and everything. She thought of the vows they'd spoken, hollow words given weight only by their desperate need for each other's particular form of salvation. Outside, the desert wind stirred dust against the windows like fingers tapping for entrance. Sarah closed her eyes and wondered if redemption could really grow from such strange soil, if two people could build something real from the ruins of their separate tragedies. Time would tell. Time, and the quiet courage of two souls learning to trust in the space between heartbeats, in the shared silence of survivors who'd found their way to each other across a wilderness of loss. When her dead husband's gang came for revenge, Sarah faced an impossible choice: warn the sheriff who saved her, or let the past bury them both in blood. 6 months of marriage had taught Sarah the rhythm of Thomas's coffee ritual. Every morning at 5:30, he'd rise in the gray pre-dawn darkness and pad barefoot to the kitchen. The sound of him grinding beans would drift through their adobe walls like a gentle prayer, followed by the whisper of flames catching kindling and the familiar bubble of water coming to life. By the time Sarah dressed and joined him, 2 cups would be waiting, his black as midnight, hers softened with cream he'd started keeping just for her. They discovered this small tenderness without speaking of it, the way desert flowers find water in hidden places. "Rider's coming," Thomas said, setting down his cup. His voice carried no alarm, but Sarah caught the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes tracked toward the rifle propped beside the door. She followed his gaze through the kitchen window. 3 men approached on horseback, moving with the easy confidence of wolves returning to familiar hunting grounds. Sarah's blood turned to ice water as recognition hit her like a physical blow. Billy Kane rode point, his red beard braided with silver bells that chimed with each step of his horse. Behind him came the Taggart twins, identical faces carved from the same piece of granite, both bearing the rope burn scars they'd earned in Yuma prison before Jack broke them out. "Jack's gang. What remained of it?" "You know them," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. Sarah's hands trembled as she set down her coffee cup. Billy Kane, Tommy, and Pete Taggart. They rode with. She couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Thomas nodded slowly, his fingers drumming against the wooden table. "Kane's wanted for the Tucson bank job. Killed 2 clerks and a little girl who got in the way. Taggart's broke out of territorial prison last month." He paused, studying her face. "Question is, what do they want with me?" Sarah knew. God help her. She knew exactly why they'd come. "Your brother," she whispered. Thomas's jaw tightened. 3 years ago, Deputy Marshal James Brennan had died in a shootout with the McKinnon gang outside Flagstaff. Thomas had never spoken of it directly, but Sarah had pieced the story together from overheard conversations and old wanted posters. James had been green, eager to prove himself. The bullet that killed him had come from Billy Kane's gun, but Jack McKinnon had been the one to plan the robbery that led to the ambush. "They think I married you for information," Thomas said quietly. "Think you told me where they hole up, how they operate. Did you?" The question escaped before Sarah could stop it. Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah saw something in his gray eyes that made her chest tight. Not anger at her suspicion, but a deep, quiet hurt that she could even ask. "No," he said simply. "I married you because I was tired of being alone, and you needed someone to stand between you and a federal noose." Nothing more complicated than that. But it had become more complicated, hadn't it? Somewhere between shared morning coffee and comfortable silences, between the way he brought her wildflowers from his evening rides and how she'd started mending his shirts without being asked, something had grown between them like desert roses, beautiful and unexpected and fragile as spun glass. The riders had stopped 50 yards from a house, close enough to talk, but far enough to avoid easy rifle range. Billy Kane dismounted and walked forward alone, his hands visible but never far from his guns. "Sheriff Brennan," he called out, "we need to have ourselves a conversation." Thomas stepped onto the small porch, Sarah close behind him. She could feel violence hanging in the morning air like the promise of lightning. "Billy Kane," Thomas replied evenly, "you're a long way from your usual territory." "Funny thing about territory," Kane said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "It has a way of shifting when a man's got business to settle." His pale eyes found Sarah, and his smile held all the warmth of a sidewinder's gaze. "Morning, Sarah. Been wondering what happened to you after poor Jack took sick." "Leave her out of this," Thomas said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had kept him alive through 16 years of frontier law. "Oh, but she's the reason we're here, Sheriff." Kane's grin widened. "See, word travels fast in our line of work. Heard tell Jack's widow went and married herself a lawman. Real romantic story, except for one small problem." Sarah's throat felt like sand, but she forced herself to speak. "What problem?" "The problem," said Tommy Taggart, riding closer, "is that your dear departed husband cost us a fortune in gold when he led that posse to our camp outside Phoenix. Cost us 3 good men, too. And cost me my brother," Thomas added quietly. The words hung in the desert air like smoke. Sarah felt the weight of old violence, old debts that demanded payment in blood. This was the legacy of loving an outlaw. Not just your own sins, but the accumulated weight of every choice, every bullet, every life destroyed in the pursuit of easy money. "That's right," Kane said. "Your brother. Good man, for what I hear. Shame about what happened to him." The false sympathy in his voice made Sarah's skin crawl. "But here's the thing, Sheriff. I got nothing personal against you. This is about Jack McKinnon, and since Jack ain't here to answer for his sins." He let the words trail off, but his meaning struck Sarah like a fist. They couldn't kill Jack, so they'd settle for killing his widow. And if Thomas tried to protect her, they'd kill him too. "How many men you got backing you?" Thomas asked conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Enough," Kane replied. Sarah closed her eyes and felt the weight of inevitability settling over her like desert dust. This was always how it would end, with gunfire and blood and the people she cared about paying for her dead husband's crimes. She thought of the morning coffee growing cold on the kitchen table, of Thomas bringing her wildflowers, of the quiet life they'd been building together one careful day at a time. She thought of love and how it sometimes were the face of sacrifice. "I'll come with you," she said suddenly. "Sada, no." Thomas's voice carried a note she'd never heard before, something raw and desperate that cut through his careful control. "It's me you want," she continued, stepping off the porch. "Jack's dead, but I'm here. I'll pay his debts." "Sarah," Thomas caught her arm, his grip gentle but firm. When she looked up at him, she saw her own reflection in his eyes, and something else. Something that made her heart stop and start again. Love. Quiet and deep and absolutely certain. "I won't let them take you," he said, and Sarah heard the vow in his words. Not the hollow promises they'd spoken in the church 6 months ago, but something real and blood-deep and worth dying for. The first shot came from behind the house, one of the Taggart twins trying to flank them. Thomas shoved Sarah through the doorway and threw himself after her as bullets began chewing splinters from the adobe walls. "How many rounds you got?" Sarah asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Enough," Thomas replied, checking his rifle. "You know how to shoot?" Sarah thought of Jack teaching her to handle a gun during the long, paranoid nights when every shadow might hide a bounty hunter. "I know." Thomas handed her his spare Colt, and their fingers brushed as she took it. Such a small touch, but it carried the weight of everything they'd never said to each other. "Together?" he asked. "Together," she confirmed. They faced the doorway side by side as boots thundered across their small porch. Sarah raised the unfamiliar weight of Thomas's gun and thought of morning coffee, of wildflowers, of the quiet man who'd offered her sanctuary and accidentally taught her heart to beat again. When Billy Kane's shadow filled the doorway, she didn't hesitate. The gunfight lasted maybe 3 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the smoke cleared and the desert fell silent again, Sarah found herself kneeling beside Thomas in a spreading pool of his blood, her hands pressed against a wound in his side that looked too big for any mortal man to survive. "Don't you die on me," she whispered fiercely. "Don't you dare die on me, Thomas Brennan." His eyes found hers, and even through the pain, she saw that quiet smile she'd grown to love. "Not planning on it, Mrs. Brennan. Got too much to live for now." As she held pressure on his wound and listened for the sound of help approaching, Sarah finally understood what Jack had tried to tell her in those final moments. Redemption wasn't about forgetting the past or washing away old sins. It was about choosing who you became despite them. It was about finding someone worth fighting for, and discovering that sometimes love announced itself not with poetry and passion, but with shared coffee and comfortable silence and the fierce determination to protect what you'd built together. It was about learning that home wasn't a place, but a person willing to stand beside you when the shadows of yesterday came calling. Thomas squeezed her hand, and Sarah squeezed back, watching the sun rise over their small adobe house where wild roses had begun to grow along the garden wall. Beautiful and unexpected and strong enough to bloom in even the hardest ground.